So let's get started. Good day, everyone. Welcome to the fourth of 9 office hours focused on Zowe V2.
All right, let me start with the vNext feature. So for Zowe Explorer vNext, we have two major features that we've implemented. One is the use of the team configuration file. So if you are interested in implementing team configuration uh, into your extension, you can already use that. You can clone our repository and you can look around or maybe check how we implemented team configuration and check it out. We also improve our extensible APIs, and I want to point out the profiles cache API. And this profiles cache API supports team configuration. So if you're an extender who extends Zowe Explorer, who uses Zowe Explorer APIs, you can check out or play with the profiles cache API, and then it is already available for you to use the team configuration, and as well as also have this backwards compatibility with V1. So these two features, you can clone the again what I said, you can clone the repository and try it out with your extension. Next slide, please. So I would like to take note that there are breaking changes when we implement or when we do a release for V2. The first one is the Zowe Explorer View IDs. So we have updated we have updated our view IDs so that we could have consistency in formatting. Before, it's just Zoe dot and then the function name. Now we've added DS, USS, and jobs to specify um, which tree and which action these what command are you using. So if let's say you're using this view IDs in, I don't know, maybe in your configuration when you're trying to add menus into the Zoe Explorer tree, then you have to take note that it will affect you, that these changes in the view IDs can break your extension. Next slide, please. There are two more things. The second one is the migration of old settings. So in the spirit of standardization, we do want to have a standardized setting name for Zowe Explorer as a command. So we added Zowe Explorer in all of our commands. So if you go to the command palette, you can see that there's already a Zowe Explorer at the beginning. And the last one is that we remove the associate profiles feature in our extension. All right, so for the V2 conformance, before I begin, I would like to take note that the V2 conformance for Zowe Explorer is still in progress and it still may change in the future. There's an open PR available in our repository. If you want to review it or comment, please do so. But for now, this is what we've come up with our conformance. So the first one, there will be changes. The general extension. So in terms of user setting names, we are going to set it from best practice to required. It means that the extender should avoid that starting the settings name with the prefix Zoe. So in the previous slide, you saw that we use Zoe.ts, Zoe.uss. So if you're an extender, you shouldn't use the word Zoe because this word Zoe is reserved for Zowe Explorer extension and other extension maintained by the Zoe project, like the Zowe FTP extension and as well as the Kix extension. We have a new criteria that we will add in the general extension, which we will set to best practice, and that is the V1 profile support. So it means that extenders should have a backwards compatibility, and it is able to support V1 type of profiles. I've added links for our developer docs here. If you are interested, you can check out some of the rules that we've added or to help you create your extension. So the next criteria, the accessing profiles. So we have technically these three are existing, but it's under a different criteria. And from data provider extension, we move it up to accessing profile. So the first one, if you're an extender who accesses profile, one of our best practice is support for base profile and tokens. Um, And the next criteria that we are setting from best practice to required is the team configuration file. Since this V2 conformance feature is about team configuration file, we would like extenders to support the Zowe CLI team configuration, the Zowe CLI 7 team configuration file format, and of course, support basically the team configuration. And in line with that, we would like also to add the secure credentials from best practice to required, where extension calls the Zowe Explorer provided method for initialization of secure credentials at startup. For the next criteria, these are extension adding menus. So we have an existing criteria called menu names. We're going to change that to adding new menu names. It will be changed. It will still be a best practice that extension who adds new commands and context menu entries to the Zowe Explorer preview should have a consistent with the terminology and naming convention of the existing Zowe Explorer menu entries. And I've added as well the link here of our extending document, so you would have a reference on how we are, let's say, recommending how you're going to add menu commands in Zowe Explorer. Excuse me. Two new criteria we've added is that the updating of existing menu items. So we set this to required that extender will not override or does not override any existing Zowe Explorer command and context menu. So if we have an existing command, if it's the same name if the command that you want to add will be the same name that we have in Zowe Explorer, just make sure that it's not overwriting the existing command that we have in Zowe Explorer. And the last one is we set the context menu items from best practice to required, where contributing commands to Zowe Explorer should only be added as a views right-click context menus. So like I've said, this is a continuously changing conformance, and these are all the conformance that we've added so far. If you have any question, please feel free to ask me now, or maybe you can ask me later in the Slack. And I've also added our conformance document here in this slide. And that's all for me.
All righty. Thanks, Shelley.
Thank you.
So at this point, just again, we'll reiterate that all things related to V2 are on this. Well, we'd like to believe that they're there, and we continually revise it based upon feedback and any information that we receive. Zowe.org/vNext. As I had mentioned earlier, all of the office hours recordings are available there. If you go to the webpage and simply click on office hours, and we continually update the FAQs. Any questions related to Zowe Explorer and V2 at this point, either breaking changes, conformance, or anything else?
Hey, Jelly, it's Joe. I had one quick question about secure credentials. So
yes,
the Zowe Explorer is going to be using the team, the config.json, zowe.config.json file. In that file, you don't actually have to store your username and password in the secure area. If you wanted to, you can just actually add them as properties, and the CLI will still work. It's the same true with the Zowe Explorer. If you wanted to, if you had a profile where they weren't stored in the secure field, would it still work? Okay,
yes, that's true still for Zowe Explorer.
All right, thanks, Jelly.
So as much as possible, we do want to have the same experience that you have in CLI and at the same time with the Zowe Explorer. So, yeah.
Yeah, we definitely encourage it, but it can't be a must have a requirement, because there are platforms that we want to support that don't have a Kita implementation, such as Kubernetes and Eclipse Shea. So for there, at the moment, they still need to be unencrypted.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Peter. But plus, for some people, and even a Mac desktop, sometimes there are people who just want to not have it stored. Thank you.
We had a related discussion around this also in the CLI office hours in terms of providing, again, the interface of that authentication provider in the CLI, so that there could be another implementation that does not use keytar that we can then work on for something like Eclipse Shade.
Angela, I've got one other quick question. You may have covered it or not. Just so I know Jeff and myself and a few others have been playing around with V2. With V1, the Zowe Explorer operated quite independently from your CLI, if you had your CLI on the desktop. For V2, does it prerequisite the CLI? Does it operate independently of it? So you can have the CLI at one level and the Zowe Explorer at a different level? So
let me rephrase your question. Is it like, are we requiring the installation of Zowe CLI when you want to use Zowe Explorer vNext?
Yeah, that's a good question to start with. Yeah.
Yeah. So Rochelle, please correct me. Please keep me honest. I do believe that we don't have dependency on the installation of the Zowe CLI. We did remove that part. Now I'm not sure.
So for the most part, it's true. So if you can initialize the team configuration by Zowe Explorer, and then you can use it just as you would in the CLI. I think the only thing that is missing from there is the ability to use or to use the team config to automatically add token value and token authentication. So you would have to manually update your team config to be able to use tokens.
And it's certainly a design goal, right? That we even have a best practice in our conformance criteria to not require the CLI installation, that the Zowe extension can just work out of the box, have all the functionality, or at least a big part of it, without CLI being installed as well, so that people don't have to install Node.js and all the CLI packages, that they get everything through the VS Code marketplace if they want to.
Right, thanks, Peter. Yeah, that was right. If somebody just goes in cold to the VS Code marketplace, you want them to have a good experience, and also just not have to drop to a terminal. Yeah, if there was anything that they had to do. Thanks.
Other questions, comments?
I have another one. So I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So from a customer perspective, so if I go and look at the VS Code marketplace right now for the Zowe Explorer, let me have a look. 49,000 unique downloads, which is phenomenal. Congratulations, everybody that's worked on achieving that. Of which it says 226,000 downloads. So that's about a ratio of what, 5 to 1. So everybody who's downloaded it has updated it 4 times on average to achieve those amazing numbers. At some point, to get version 2 right now, you have to get the VSRX file and add it. When version 2 comes out, will people be upgrading it literally the same way that they go from 1.x to 1.x+1? Will it be seamless?
Yes. So our goal, at least, that once the V2 release will happen, the V6 file will be added into the marketplace, and that will be the new LTS version.
Okay, so
yeah.
All right, thanks. So when I did that, obviously it wasn't in the marketplace. I added it myself by hand. None of my profiles appeared because all my profiles were still in V1 format. So I had to drop to the command line to do, I think it's called Zowe config update, or there's some really beautiful command that morphs them across. So will that occur automatically for somebody who adds V2 in from the marketplace? So all of their data will just be automatically converted to V2?
So if you're using V1 profiles and you haven't really created any config file, either in the global or the project file, your V1 profiles should appear or at least should be loaded as per normal. And
Oh,
that
okay.
that is our goal, like to have that backwards compatibility. But once you create your config file, the config file that you've created will be read and that will be uploaded. Your V1 profiles will not be, you will not be able to use your V1 profiles at all. So it's just one or the other. It's either config file or V1 profiles.
Okay, so does that mean that V1 profiles remain backward compatible throughout the lifecycle of V2?
Yes, it should be. At least that's what we want.
But the same is not true for CLI, is it?
It is the same for
It is,
CLI.
Mike? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
thanks.
you just can't use, so V1 profiles are still supported in V2. They're just deprecated, so we're planning to remove them in a future V3. As long as we don't receive significant feedback otherwise from the community. And the only thing is once you opt into the new V2 team config, you can't use them interchangeably. So once you're using team config, you're all in on team config. It's not a mix and match.
Okay, that was my bad then. Okay.
And we do not plan to automatically migrate people because they might not want to. So it might be too significant for them an impact. So we want to make this an explicit use operation to say, now I'm ready to migrate.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a clever way or something, perhaps when you're issuing the Zowe profiles command. Right now they're flagged as deprecated, but if there was a clever way to sort of know that the team config was there and somehow make it more obvious that they shouldn't be used or something. Okay.
Right. Well, if you, well, in the Zowe Explorer, the V1 profiles wouldn't show up if you're using
Right,
a
yeah.
team config. In CLI, if you try to use a V1 profile command while team config is in use, you get a message saying that you cannot use V1 profiles while team config is in use. It's pretty explicit.
Okay, so then it's good enough already. Thanks, Mike.
Mhm.
Thanks.
And we do have a user explicit migration utility for this when folks want to change their V1 profiles to V2. It's a Zowe config convert profiles command, and it has the option to either archive your V1 profiles to a renamed directory in case you want to, revert back, or you can append a -- I believe it's delete or _ flag. In either case, you can remove everything from V1 profile format, including entries into your secure credential store, and move it all to V2 in a single operation. If you decide, you're satisfied with the conversion.
Perhaps one thing we should mention in respect to your first slide, Mike, with the support of V1. That can't happen through the marketplace, so they don't support concurrent releases there, right? We would have to rename and create a new offering there, which we probably don't want to. We want people to migrate. But then to be still on a 1.x version, we probably need to then provide explicit downloads for people that they would switch off their automated updates in VS Code and manually install the downloaded 1.x version. I assume that will be the model we go with, but I'm not sure actually we discussed that, right, Jelly or anyone?
Yeah, I
No,
think
we haven't discussed it yet.
I think that's a good point. We can discuss that further on
Yep.
Thursday's call. But yeah, if something happens to the latest 1.x release, we have to have a means to get them, a 1.x+1 release to address any sort of security issues or anything like that.
Right, yeah.
And just for clarity, so are you now referring to folks who want to remain on the V1 LTS going forward?
Yes.
I see. Okay, gotcha. And then Mike, for clarification on the profile conversion utility, I'm going back to a question that was asked earlier with requiring CLI for Zowe Explorer. Let's say I'm a Zowe Explorer user. I don't use CLI. Will I be able to use the conversion utility independently?
No, not yet.
No, I don't believe
Okay.
that's implemented. Again, to be clear, from a technology stack perspective, the Zowe Explorer is not dependent in any way on CLI. Now it is dependent on that shared config file, and some operations around creating or converting to that shared config file have not been implemented yet in Zowe Explorer. But if you had a site administrator rolling out a configuration file at a site, then end users would just obtain that single file from their administrator, install the Zowe Explorer software, and be able to just start using the product. They wouldn't have to do any additional things around profiles or anything like that. But yeah, no, the conversion isn't built into Zowe Explorer. If you want to convert from V1 to that, you have to use the CLI. And I don't know, we can listen to feedback from the community on whether or not we have a lot of users who don't leverage the CLI and whether such a conversion utility is necessary. But from a prioritization perspective, that would be some work for a one-time operation, which is already provided in a separate tool, right? You could just use the CLI as a migration utility for Zowe Explorer if you wanted to. Yeah, pending feedback from the community, but I don't believe that work's been prioritized. Jelly, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. Any sort of conversion utility?
No, it wasn't prioritized.
It's a good point though, right? The init we want to do so that you can, if you're a new user and get started, you can run the init from Zowe Explorer, but the migration, that's probably a more complex beast we need to properly understand, analyze, and
Yeah, and depending upon the feedback, as Mike said, there may be a single user that may need CLI to invoke the conversion and share things out, or there are a number of different scenarios that could be taken into considerations there.
yeah, but we have 50,000 people installed it, right? So I assume it's more than one.
Yeah.
You do, and so the VS Code Marketplace is quite a trusted source to download things. Perhaps it's just because it's got Microsoft's banners above it. NPM has had quite a few, quite a few bumps recently. The whole, colors.js and faker.js and all that stuff recently. So I know some customers now that are asking questions about it as a distribution channel. So it'd be interesting to see what happens.
Well, as a representative also of the Eclipse project, I like to also mention OpenVSX, which is an open source alternative to the marketplace where we publish as well. And that allows it to integrate also with open source variants of VS Code, like VS Codium uses it, or Eclipse Thea, Eclipse Shay. So we also publish there. And unfortunately, the counters were broken there for a long time. They are back up now. So now we can start counting the downloads from there as well. And perhaps we can monitor that one too.
Cool. I've got one other question about profiles. So if you download the extensions, the existing CLI extensions, and there's a lot of them, 25 or plus or something. If you look at the profiles directory, you have a directory for each extension with the the group ID and then a meta.yaml file. But if you look at the V2, there's the Zowe schema.json file. So if somebody downloads something if somebody has a V1 extension and they download that V1 extension, is there anything that has to be done to make that compatible with the Zowe config.json? Because how does that same information in the meta.yaml that contains things like what the default profile is and the rules, how does that get into the Zowe schema.json file?
So in terms of the schema, this is currently worked on by Billy and Rochelle. So they are thinking of doing an automatic update of the schema itself once you've, let's say, downloaded an extension that uses an additional schema. Let's say, for example, FTP. We want to automatically insert the schema into the schema that JSON file, but only for global ones. For project level configuration, we're still going to discuss this, but so far, what we're thinking is that it will be manually added or maybe copying the global schema to the project level schema.
Joe, were you asking in terms of VS Code extensions or in terms of CLI plugins?
It's hard. In my mind's eye, I view both of them as different form factors on so much overlapping technology that it's. But I was asking it on behalf.
So for CLI plugins, it's automatic because CLI plugins register into CLI as a product. And then just instead of representing their definition as a meta file, meta YAML file, it's represented in that JSON schema. There's really nothing that I think plugins have to do. It's a little different on the VS Code side because now we're having an application that's not a CLI plugin have a need to influence this schema file, right? And we also have to update schema at like install time, right? So you can imagine if you created a project schema and then you install a plugin, that schema you had previously generated for that project's out of scope or out of date, right? We dynamically will update the global one because we know you installed a CLI product, but we can't, we're not necessarily scouring your directory to find all existence of Zowe schemas. So you could somehow get an out of date schema, at which point you just have to run a command to update the schema or copy, sort of as Jelly's suggesting here, copy your global schema into your project directory.
Okay, so in the case of the Kicks plugin, CLI extension, for example, right, when you download that from npm, you have the kicks_meta.yaml file, which effectively contains the schema, and it also contains what the default profile is. But if you then want to start working with V2, so you have the Zowe config.json and you put your profiles in there, because the Zowe schema.json hasn't been updated, you don't have any nice IntelliSense, content assist, and anything for adding those kicks. I don't know what to call them because I don't want to call them profiles. Adding all of the properties for the kicks information. So you end up with both. You end up with the kicks_meta.yaml, and you also end up with it in the Zowe schema in your Zowe config.json and the.
Yeah, I mean, the YAML never had sort of any IntelliSense around it, but just focusing on the question in regards to the JSON schema. If you install the plugin and then initialize the config, you will get IntelliSense regardless of your project or if you're doing this in globally in your Zowe home folder. If you had already started creating profiles or setting up your project config and then you installed, I don't believe that JSON would be updated. You would have to manually update the schema before you would get the IntelliSense for just a project. For the global one in the Zowe home directory, we dynamically update that. There's also, I think, a flag if you want to update a specific project, you can run a command. But in general, yeah, just because you installed it, that wouldn't work. But what you can do is you can actually re-init the config, and then it would add the kick stuff. That's for the CLI plugin case. So I believe the CLI plugin case is relatively well handled. The trouble would be is if you're installing the Kicks extension, but you're not installing the Kicks CLI plugin, and that Kicks VS Code extension is using the config, will that JSON schema be dynamically updated? And I think some of that is what Jelly was talking about in the decision around they'll handle it in a similar way where it's going to update the global, but not necessarily if you have that in a project.
Okay, thanks.
I haven't tried it yet, but if you don't install the plugin, but you added the config files, does the base schema allow custom properties, or will it show then those as errors until you have properly registered the plugin and merged the schemas?
So it's forgiving. We're not doing an extra check there. You can actually, and people do that. You can, and I think Dan Koloski wrote a blog on this as well. You're not limited to profile properties in your config anymore. You can put, if you find yourself constantly putting a value on the command line, you can go ahead and store that in the config. You just won't get the IntelliSense when you're adding it, but you can add whatever properties you want into that config file.
Yeah, that's actually a really nice feature.
Thanks. Yeah. I think folks have used that in creative ways that wouldn't necessarily have thought of. So it's cool to provide that flexibility. You know, I think the flip side of that was kind of with great power comes great responsibilities. If folks are making mistakes and things, we're not double checking that. But in general, I think it's been a good decision.
But I think JSON generally is too hard to write, right? I would prefer if alternatively people can write these as YAML as well, and you can choose, right? Just like with many other tools, where they can either or. Especially have nested objects with the closing brackets and so on. Even though VS Code gives you help with that, I've seen people in VS Code settings having incorrectly nested objects as well, and not ignoring the red squiggles for whatever reason and being confused.
So I just want to circle back to a little bit of the conversation with the, what if you have an existing, even if it's a V2 profile and you install something new, whether it's CLI or VS Code related, do we have recommendations for those scenarios documented? And I'm wondering if we don't, maybe we should consider that since it was raised in this forum.
We have documentation around creating the team configuration. We could probably improve that documentation with some of these edge scenarios where you're installing something after you create the config. How do you update the config? I think the documentation is written in the sense of install the plugins you want to have at your site. Now either initialize configuration or run the conversion utility. That's certainly true for the conversion utility. Install all your vNext profiles and then run the conversion utility one time, because we're going to handle some special cases for those extensions. But the places where you're incrementally installing plugins and needing to update config, that can be handled. I think that'll be, though, not in, like, we're kind of separating the doc now into end user documentation and administration documentation. And certainly in some cases, the end user is the administrator, right? Some people are trying this out for the first time. It's the same person. We're trying to be a little bit more clear with that in our documentation, and Jim's doing a good job separating those pieces. But I think that's good feedback, and we can improve the doc based on this.
Yeah, I think, Mike, from my perspective, the one, and it's not necessarily a justified worry, but I've seen this with other software projects I've worked on where, for the 49,000 users or something, assume that all of them are going to hit update. They're not going to want to see things disappearing, right? Like data that they'd held before. They're going to want to have the most seamless experience to start enjoying the new features. That's all. And if all of a sudden something disappears and then they have to go read a piece of documentation that says, well, actually get the CLI and run this command or something, I don't think that's necessarily the case. But, or perhaps they were a CLI user, or perhaps they weren't, or perhaps they had an extension, or perhaps they didn't, or I just feel you want to kind of protect and future-proof. Sorry, Rose, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I guess my point there, Joe, is to maybe have, the big box warning in the documentation, because if we can prevent a user or consumer or even an extender getting themselves into that scenario by making them aware of something ahead of time, it seems to me that it makes sense to try to do that. If there is a specific order that we're recommending that folks install and roll out the config in this example, if there's a specific order that will give them the best chance for success, then I think it seems like it would make sense to make them aware of that.
Yeah, I think the rollout is the important piece here, because if you're talking to shops that haven't had to like roll this out, all the end users are managing all of their own configuration and likely installation, right? They're all managing it with profiles today, and if they upgrade, they're not going to necessarily be impacted. They would only change to team config if they felt that, managing V1 profiles is burdensome.
Mhm.
In the case of rollout, the recommended strategy is, I think it's also pretty clear in the documentation. One person creates this config, sends it to their users, and then their users just use the product. They don't have to worry about anything. And there's no sort of administration layer today in V1 LTS. That was the problem I guess we were solving. Now, some shops have created scripts because creating profiles was difficult, and everybody at a site just getting started runs some script that sets up their profiles. I've seen some of that. But I think the most concerning case is the case where the user is the administrator. They probably need clear options on what to do and what order.
And with that, I am going to close us out. Thank you, Jelly. Thank you, Mike.